Every Sunday morning, Hannah would go to the animal shelter as if in her own world, where, surrounded by cats and dogs and the smell of old wooden cages, she would forget about herself for a while, or rather, find the person she had always wanted to be. They had been married for 8 years, but their marriage had slowly faded like an old photograph in the sun, and a love they once felt seemed to have melted away under the weight of days, deeds, and pointless arguments. Her life with Zack had been like a closed door lately, like the walls of a house with invisible locks. That morning, the shelter was in full swing. Hannah was cleaning the cages, filling the bowls with water, milking a couple of kittens who were a little jealous of her, trying to grab her by the fingers. She noticed the front door open, and a man walked in. Middle-aged, tall, with a slight blush and a kind smile. He was alone, without a family, and he looked like he was thinking about things, like he was picking out a pet with special care. "Good morning," he said, and his voice sounded warm and easy. "Good morning. How can I help you?" She responded, politely smiling. He looked around, as if he was picking out words carefully. "I think I need a new friend. I'm Ben." He reached out his hand. "Can you look at someone who's sure to be adored?" Her smile got a little wider. He said something more sincere than she'd heard in ordinary conversation for a long time. "It's very nice, Ben. I'm Hannah, and I'm sure there are many here who would be happy to have such a host," she replied, taking his hand. The mutual handshake lasted a little longer than it needed to. His hand was warm, and it kind of stirred her up, and she didn't expect that after a handshake, her heart would respond like that. But her smile, her soft look, her gentle sincerity, it seemed to melt the ice that had been built up over the years with Zack. And they started to walk around the shelter, and Hannah spoke about each of the animals with such warmth as if she'd known them all her life. And Ben listened to her every word, nodding and occasionally asking questions. He laughed as he watched the puppies act and thoughtfully stroked the cats, which, when they saw him, immediately began to cling to his arms as if they felt his kindness. She was always amazed at the intuition of the animals. "Which one do you think is the most loyal?" "Duke, I guess," she said, watching Ben reach for the bars, and the dog immediately licks his hand, looking confidently into his eyes. "But he's attached once and for all," Ben thought, smiling, and then he looked at her, as if he was really thinking about her words, but there was something else in his gaze, something that made Hannah feel a strange emotion. She tried not to reveal it by nodding and looking at the cage. "Animals are sometimes much more loyal than humans," she said, perhaps too loudly, but Ben didn't comment. Instead, he continued to look at Duke as if he was faking something. A few minutes passed, and Ben suddenly lowered his voice slightly. "Have you been working here for a long time?" "A few years already," Hannah replied. "This is my Sunday class. It's a little distracting." Ben nodded, not trying to figure out the details. He was fed up with her words, and there was something reassuring about that. They spent almost an hour and a half together, but Hannah felt that for the first time in a long time, this was exactly what she needed. A carefree, calm conversation, with no expectations or demands. Finally, when they were already outside, Ben stopped and, not knowing what to say, slightly awkwardly fixed his jacket collar. "Hannah, thank you for the morning," he said, as if unwillingly saying goodbye. It was interesting, especially to meet someone who loves animals so much, and she smiled, and she squeezed her hands to cover up her unnecessary excitement, and she said, "Thank you. It's rare to meet people like that." And when he left, she couldn't figure out what was really exciting about her, whether it was him, or his look, or maybe how long she hadn't felt this easy with another person. Even though it was late, the lights were on in the living room, and she saw Zack behind the curtains, sitting with his laptop again, his head in his business, and the whole day had passed, but the memory of meeting Ben at the shelter was haunting her. It would seem like a normal conversation, a brief exchange of glances, but it's been tearing her mind apart for hours, like something old and dusty inside her has started beating again. She got out of the car, took a deep breath, and headed for the door. Zack didn't even notice her coming. He didn't even look up when she walked into the house, dropped her coat, and took off her shoes. Hannah quietly walked into the kitchen, opened the fridge, and stared at the shelves, more to avoid seeing than actually picking something for dinner. She knew that tonight, like so many others, would be the same, each in his own mind, on his own island. Zack looked focused as always. He worked hard to ensure their well-being. But over the years, their lives turned into a gray, mundane, endless string of the same days. And even when Zack finally closed his laptop and came to her, it was just routine questions about how the day had gone. And then silence. Never the soul talk they had when they first started dating. There were never any questions that showed that he knew her at all, that he knew what was inside her. "How was her day?" His voice came as she entered the living room and sat carefully on the sofa. She gazed at the screen of his laptop tables and numbers. "Can we not talk about it for once?" She thought, but she didn't say anything. "Of course," she said, nodding unwillingly. She got a little tired. Zack nodded, not looking at her, and he went back to the screen. She wanted to add something, tell him about how his day was, about the shelter, about the kittens that were jumping around in the corner so funny. But she realized that he wasn't really interested. It was superfluous. "I'm on a business trip tomorrow," Zack added, finally looking at her. "She'll be gone for a few days." Her first feeling was relief. She could have spent a few days alone, without the tense evenings and the silent expectation of his attention. But then something else came along. She realized that it was hardly normal to feel relief at the thought of her husband leaving. It was painful, although she had been used to ignoring such feelings lately. "Where is she this time?" She asked, more out of politeness than interest. "Los Angeles. A few meetings with partners. I'll be back by Friday," he replied, already distracted by her. Silence hung between them. They were sitting next to each other, like neighbors in a subway, accidentally on the same bench, and Hannah could feel the cold slowly spreading through her body, as if it were absorbing into her skin. And this sense of alienation was not new, but it seemed more painful now, because she suddenly remembered what communication could be. Light, soulful, simple. She remembered the morning at the shelter, the moment when she and Ben were exchanging mutually understanding glances, and she decided to leave Zack and go to the bedroom. And as she got up from the couch, Hannah glanced at him briefly and caught herself again, her attention returning to Ben, to his voice, to the slight sincerity that had touched her so deeply. She couldn't help but think and feel. Zack noticed her movement, looked up. "Are you going to sleep?" he asked in the meantime. She nodded, trying not to meet him. "Yes, I'm up early tomorrow." He broke off work again and gave her a look that was neither interested nor warm. And then she saw nothing in his eyes that she had been looking for, and she felt a sudden sense of pity for herself, not for him, and she thought, "Is this how it's going to be?" "Good night," he said, having already switched his attention to his laptop. Hannah stared at him for a few more seconds, as if hoping that he would suddenly look at her differently, say something important, break the agonizing silence. But he was again completely engrossed in numbers and tables. He didn't even notice her quietly leaving the living room. So she closed the bedroom door behind her, went to the bed, and sat down, stroking the pillow, and it was scary to admit, but it was clear to her that Zack had long since ceased to be the man she had married. She couldn't ignore the gap between them anymore, pretending to still hold on to their marriage. And her thoughts went back to Ben, and of course it was wrong to think about another man, but she didn't do anything. She just saw, felt, and understood someone who was listening and understanding. The thought of that made her heart beat harder, as if something was alive inside. After taking a hot shower and washing, she turned off the light and went to bed. The silence of the room became her solace, a release from the silence that had so weighed on her next to Zack. She would need to go to the shelter again tomorrow. She had already made up her mind to spend more time there than usual. She knew it was a kind of escape, but she needed it. Zack would be as alien to her as ever. But now that she knew she could feel alive, there was no turning back. She loved helping animals, watching them react, seeing how they're drawn to people despite all their fears and past resentments. And Zack was away on business again, and her days weren't limited to his return. She wanted to have a cup of strong coffee, to think, and finally get rid of the light but constant anxiety that had plagued her for the last few days. She went inside and was about to order, when she suddenly noticed a familiar figure. Ben was sitting at the corner table, focused on the buck. She wanted to turn around and leave, but her legs carried her to his side. He looked up, and there was a sincere smile on his face. "Hannah?" He called out with a slight surprise, but it was clear that he was happy to see her. "What a miracle! Sit down." She sat across the table, feeling a slight excitement, as if she had returned at the same moment they were talking in the shelter. Only now there were no noisy dogs and no cat calls around, and they were alone. Coincidence? Maybe, she asked, trying to hide her embarrassment. Maybe. Maybe the stars just decided we should meet again, he said, not taking his eyes off her. They ordered coffee, and the conversation went on casually, as if they were old friends. He even mentioned that as a child, he always dreamed of a huge golden retriever with which to go camping and travel. Hannah listened as if she were plunging into another world full of simple joys and uncomplicated troubles. "And you, Hannah?" he asked suddenly, as if studying her. "What would you like?" The question caught her by surprise. No one had asked her about it for years. Even she herself. What did she want? Simple, easy happiness? Or something more complex? The understanding, the intimacy, the thing that once bound her to Zack, but had long since lost its power? "I think sometimes we all cling to the same things we used to do, afraid to change things," he said softly. "And then one day we wake up and realize that life is passing us by." She was silent, feeling something inside her being torn apart by pain and longing. But strangely enough, with him, the pain was not so intense. She wasn't alone in this. Ben seemed like a man who had his share of loss and disappointment, but his outlook on life was different. He didn't seem broken. She was overcome by a sense of respect, admiration, and then fear. She was suddenly afraid that she might let that feeling go too far. When they finished their coffee, Ben looked around and smiled. "Do you have time? Can we go for a walk? The weather is great today." She nodded, although she knew that walking with him was more than just a walk. She didn't know where it would lead, but she wanted to experience that moment, the warmth and the peace. And they left the cafe and headed to the nearest park, and there was almost no wind, and the light of the sun was shining through the treetops, and Ben was telling her about his favorite places in the city, about how he sometimes just goes for a walk to get his mind right. He spoke so lightly about feelings, about simple joys, that it became even more noticeable to Hannah how Zack, on the contrary, was pushing away any personal conversations. "I've always wondered how people stay so kind in spite of everything," she said, speaking more to herself than to him. "You just realize that resentment and anger don't make life better, and sometimes you just have to let it go." And she nodded, barely realizing that this conversation had suddenly changed her perspective, and she and Zack were used to any discussion of their problems ending in either irritation or dry remarks, as if feelings were just another part of the equation. And there, with this barely known person, she felt heard, seen, as if every look, every word, meant something. And as they returned to the exit of the park, Hannah knew that the walk was over. Ben looked at her, and she noticed something warm and a little unsettling in his eyes, like he didn't want this moment to end either. "Thank you, Hannah, for the day." He was silent, picking a word, something special. She nodded, struggling with a sudden urge to say more, to explain, but instead said quietly, "I feel the same way." When they said goodbye, Hannah went home feeling that her life would never be the same, and the quiet fire that had broken in her heart, it just got a little bit louder. And when she got home, she realized that maybe she'd never forget that night again. And the next morning, Hannah felt devastated. The night went by uneasy. She dreamed of a park where she and Ben were strolling among fallen leaves, his gaze, soft and warm, which she could not forget. And in the morning she was awakened by the cold light of the gray sky outside the window, and the silence of the house seemed unbearable. Zack came back in the night, but she didn't even notice. And now, while she was making coffee in the kitchen, he went downstairs, distractedly dropping the hello on the guard, looking exhausted and agitated, which he'd become accustomed to lately. His trips became increasingly sleepless nights, filled with reports and tense conversations, and he rarely shared details. She tried to suppress the guilt that had crept in, and the thoughts of Ben, the warmth of their meeting yesterday, filled her head, and now she felt guilty in front of her husband. "I'm tired," he said. 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 "I'm tired." Hannah felt that there was some kind of hidden aggression in his voice, which was now becoming more and more apparent. She wondered, have they reached the point where conversations are reduced to angry monologues? "I think you've become different lately," she said carefully, choosing her words. She didn't know exactly what she wanted to say, but she felt that it was important. "You used to talk more, share more, and now it's like you're in the squad." Zack barely looked at her. His eyes were cold and empty. "Everything changes." "Hannah, it's called growing up." His words sounded so cold. She hardly recognized Zack at that moment. So cold, so alienated. She was so angry, but she held her tongue, trying to keep her face, at least, from herself. "Well, what do you mean?" she asked, barely holding her voice. Zack smiled, shaking his shoulders. "Nothing," he replied, turning his attention back to his cup. "It's just that I guess sometimes it seems like we each have our own lives." And he said it like it was something that was taken for granted, like they'd come to terms with the fact that they both existed separately under the same roof but in different worlds. And they had once sworn to be one, to solve problems together, to enjoy the little things together. And those last words of Zack, "We all have our lives," echoed in her head, making her remember the other day the conversation in the cafe that somehow seemed so familiar to her. All he sees is her role, her presence in the house, as if she were a part of his furniture, a familiar element of the interior. "If you think I'm estranged from you, maybe it's because you're pushing me away," she said, gathering all her determination. Zack finally looked at her, but not with surprise or attention, but rather with irritation, as if her words were preventing him from focusing on his own problems. "It's just that maybe you're thinking too much about owing someone something. You have your own business, I have mine, and maybe it's even easier." She wanted to answer, to say everything that accumulated, but something stopped her. At that moment she realized that the conversation was pointless. There are too many hidden resentments in their relationship that poison any attempt to get closer. She felt lonely, but an even stronger feeling came to be called tiredness. Tired of trying to change him, tired of trying to get his attention, tired of trying to earn the warmth she so desperately needed. And he got up from the table, threw away the little "see you tonight," and left, leaving her alone with a cooling cup of coffee and depressing thoughts. She watched him behind her, feeling her heart beat harder and harder, but not from love, but from frustration, from a overwhelming sense of loss that grew brighter with each step he took away. And as the door closed behind him, Hannah remained in the kitchen, trying to come to her senses. She realized that her life with Zack was now only an appearance, a mask that had long since been hidden behind nothing. Zack didn't want to hear her, He was just living next to her, like a stranger with whom she had only a past connection. She knew that talking to Ben, casual encounters, was a warmth she hadn't felt in a long time. It was all something that was unacceptable, almost wrong, but it was the only way she could feel life again. She decided to get out of the house. The thought of being alone made it worse, and she realized that she just couldn't stay locked up. She put on her jacket and went to the park where she and Ben had been walking yesterday, and she needed to see the place and think about it, and maybe finally admit to herself that something in her life really needed to change. She didn't know what it would lead to. She didn't understand what she was feeling, but for the first time in a long time, she wasn't tormented by the emptiness. When she got home, Zack didn't call or text. It didn't hurt her for the first time. She looked at the cold light in the empty house and felt her heart gradually free from his presence, from this inevitable longing. Hannah continued to work at the shelter every day, spending more time with the animals than usual, and her shifts became a little place to hide from the questions that were piling up inside her, and Zack continued to get into the work and barely paid attention to her. The evening passed quietly and coldly, as if they were strangers who had happened to be under the same roof. In the middle of the week, on a Thursday night, Ben came back to the shelter. He looked nervous, but when he saw her, he immediately smiled. Hannah felt a slight excitement, and it immediately dissipated the tension that had haunted her all day. Her heart, as if weakening its defenses, allowed that lightness to flood everything else. "Hello," he said softly, and there was a warm softness in his voice that made her feel calm inside. "I came in to, well, check on Duke," he added, and then lowered his eyes with slight embarrassment. "Duke will be glad to see you," Hannah responded with a sincere smile. She led him to Duke's cage, and at that moment the old dog reached out to Ben, like an old friend, and she stood by and watched Ben stroke the dog, and suddenly realized how much she missed that simple, honest warmth. Her heart was slowly but surely filled with something new, something that reminded her of joy and life. Feeling the silence between them become more tense, Ben raised his head and looked at her carefully. "Hannah, can I ask you?" he said, touching her hand gently. "You look like you're torturing something. Like you want to say something, but you're afraid." "I'm sorry. Maybe I'm imagining too much about myself." Her breathing stopped. She didn't know what she needed, but at that moment she felt that Ben was the only person who understood her. She couldn't hide her feelings anymore. "I don't know what to say. Ben, you came into my life at a time when I must have lost myself, and I don't know what to do about it." Ben looked at her, not looking away. "I just wanted to be there, even if it was hard," and those words shook her to the core. She didn't expect to hear it, but at the same time, she felt like she knew it all along. Her eyes were unwillingly filled with tears, and she tried to turn away so that Ben wouldn't notice, but he touched her hand, forcing her back to him. "And I'm not here to demand anything. I just want you to know that there's someone out there who's willing to be there for you if you feel like it." And her heart was racing, and those words were so sincere, so simple, and she knew that there was no manipulation behind them, no expectation, and Ben said that without trying to subdue her, without asking her for anything in return. He was just there, ready to be the one to support her at any moment, and they stood there, immersed in their thoughts, until the evening light dimmed, filling the shelter with soft shadows, and Hannah felt her heart fill with a warmth she hadn't felt in so long, and they both kept silent, but the silence didn't seem awkward or heavy anymore. It was filled with something sincere and peaceful, something she wanted to keep forever. And that night, when she got home, Hannah felt free for the first time in a long time. She couldn't ignore those feelings, and she wasn't going to run away from them. Her heart was filled with feelings she'd been hiding for so long, tried to escape the truth, but now it was obvious that her life was divided into a before and an after, and she felt she could no longer pretend to Zack or herself. Her eyes returned to the thoughts that had been in her mind since the day she met Ben, and she came to her senses and went into the bedroom, where Zack was already lying, staring at his phone, and he didn't care about her absence, her silence, her feelings. All that's left of their marriage is a habit, a fragment of a once bright but now faded past. "We need to talk," she said quietly but firmly, feeling her voice gain strength. Zack didn't take his phone off immediately. When he finally looked up at her, his eyes were a bit tired. "What's going on between us?" he asked, not very interested. In aside, try to calm down. She paused, looking at him. "What's going on between us? Or, rather, what's not going on anymore?" Zack looked at her again with some sort of distant displeasure. He probably hoped the conversation would end quickly, like all the other conversations they'd ever tried to have. "Anna, when do you want to hear?" he asked dryly. "What I'm working on? That we're having problems, that we're tired. You know that, right?" She shook her head. "I mean, we're not even talking as husband and wife." And he sighed like this conversation was just another annoying thing for him. "Maybe we just grew up, Hannah. People change, life changes. We have a home, we have comfort." He started as if convincing himself, but she didn't feel reassured. Everything he said only made her more convinced that her doubts were right. Zack had long since stopped seeing her as a woman, as a person who had a right to her feelings, to her happiness. He didn't feel the need to understand her. He was fed up with the formality, the ritual, and he seemed to think that she should be fed up with it. "I can't do that," she said firmly, interrupting him. "I can't hold on to a marriage that doesn't hear me. I don't want to live like two strangers anymore, try to pretend that everything is fine between us." Zack was silent, thinking about her words. He seemed to have finally realized that this was not just another fight, but something much more serious. "You mean you want a divorce?" he asked, tried to remain indifferent, but his tone slipped a bit of confusion. These words sounded hard, but when she heard them, she knew that she was mentally ready. She felt like her whole world was falling apart, but her heart was beating quietly for the first time in years. "I want to live honestly, Zack. I want to love and be loved. I want to communicate, laugh, be heard." He kept silent, knowing that he might be losing something important, something he had let go of for a long time, but he didn't try to stop her anymore, and that silence was a confirmation to her that she was right, and her decision was final. In the first few days, she was embraced by a sense of freedom and vulnerability, as if she was learning to breathe anew, and she was anxious about the future, and she was scared of the unknown, but she was growing in the sense that she had made the right move. She started seeing Ben almost every day, but their meetings were still easy and easy. He was supportive, but not pushy, not demanding. She knew Ben was ready to be there, but he didn't try to make her make that decision in a hurry. One Sunday, they met in the park. Ben brought Duke, whom he had decided to take from the shelter, and the old dog, seeing Hannah, waved his tail happily, as if he had known her all his life. They walked, talked, laughed for a long time. She felt that she was alive again with him, that she didn't have to hide her emotions or worry that she wouldn't be understood. And as they approached the exit of the park, Ben suddenly stopped and looked at her with a warmth that immediately relieved her fears. "I'll always be the one to support you." His voice was so soft, but in those words she heard everything she wanted to hear. She smiled and, taking his hand, felt her heart finally fill with warmth. This time she didn't have to explain anything, justify herself, or hide behind a mask. She knew that next to him, she could just be herself. And maybe that was the happiness she had been waiting for.